Welcome to the First Baptist Church in West Hartford, Connecticut. I am Reverend Stacy Emerson, the senior pastor here, and I welcome you to our second hour series, American Baptists, Yesterday, Today, and Tomorrow. Baptists have a rich historical heritage, and over our time together, we will explore our beginnings in Europe and early America, honoring our ancestors in faith yesterday, as well as welcome guest speakers from across our denomination and its partners to reflect on the ongoing vital and vibrant mission and ministry of American Baptists today and into tomorrow. American Baptists celebrate a great diversity among us that challenges us and grows us as we respond to God's call to be Christ's hands and feet in the world. And over these months, we will endeavor to learn, to value our heritage and our current partnerships, and to grow in faith and service to Christ. So welcome to our second hour series. We're so glad you've joined us.
Yay. Okay, here we are. Here we are. Okay, so there we go. Okay, you can skip that one. All right, Baptists. So last month we concluded with the establishment, do you remember, of the First Baptist Church, and where was it? Providence, Rhode Island. Now here you go. What date? When was it established? Gathered? 16-something? 1638. All right, I know you weren't ready for that pop quiz. It's okay. So Rhode Island was a very different place than the Massachusetts Bay Colony. In Massachusetts, the Puritans were focused on religious conformity and did so through intolerance, persecution, and exile. Baptists were declared illegal in Massachusetts, and key leaders were arrested. A law was passed against Baptists as having historically been the incendiaries of commonwealths and the infectors of person and main matters of religion. That's quite a reputation that we have, isn't it? That's us. Such persons should be banished from the colony, or if they did not live in the colony, then some other form of punishment must be inflicted. Can go on to the next. Is that right? No, let's leave it there. Obadiah Holmes, a prominent Baptist, was publicly whipped with 30 lashes in Boston's Market Street, inspiring Roger Williams to address the governor, claiming again that the civil magistrate has no business in addressing matters of conscience and religion. And furthermore, if you persecute everyone who disagrees with you on any point, sooner or later, Williams wrote, you will end up persecuting Christ himself. So Roger Williams was a great critic of that kind of thinking, that belief can be forced and enforced. Edwin Gostad wrote, if history teaches us any lessons at all, it teaches us that force applied to religion creates not a purity of faith, but a river of blood. Can go on to the next slide. There we go. Okay. So Williams and others set out to try and experiment in Rhode Island in religious liberty. Williams purchased land from the native peoples rather than take it by force. He organized a separate church and built a community where the civil government would have nothing to do with religion except for maintaining peaceable social order. And in 1663, King Charles II gave them a charter to follow this experiment, to allow it to continue, and the charter affirmed, no person within the said colony shall be anywise molested, punished, disquieted, or called in question for any differences of opinion in matters of religion. That's a bold statement, isn't it? I'm not even sure we've gotten there today, really. No other colony, state, or nation had ever offered such an extravagant freedom. And Rhode Island became a haven for religious dissenters and the first Jewish congregation in America. The prominent Puritan clergyman and leader in Massachusetts was very critical of this happening on their border. I think this was Cotton Mather's. Rhode Island had become a sink. I'm looking at Michael because he's from Rhode Island. A cesspool, a latrine into which all the refuse of the world could be dumped. He said, never in history had there been such a variety of religions together on so small a spot of ground. Antinomians, Anabaptists, Anti-Sabbatarians, Arminians, Socinians, Quakers, Ranters, everything in the world but Roman Catholics and real Christians. What a history. So throughout New England, you will notice the prominent place of the Congregationalists, right? If you go to any of small towns throughout New England, who commanded both religious and political spheres. Congregational clergy were supported by taxpayers, and only members of congregational churches could vote. To be a part of another type of church was risky business and dangerous at its worst and more costly at best. We're going to skip ahead. Just I painted that lovely picture for you of what being a Baptist was like. We're going to skip ahead. So then as the colonies, ended up turning into states and we fought the revolution and things started to solidify, in the 1700s there was a Great Awakening. Scholars will point to several Great Awakenings in our country's history. They disagree on the number, but they all agree on the first one happening sometime in the 1700s, where so every so often there is this feeling in society that everybody's kind of getting a little sleepy, getting a little lax about how they practice their faith. And so there needs to be a great awakening of us sleepy people. And so in the 1700s in New England, which was dominated by Congregationalists, there became this fervor of religious excitement and revivalism known as the Great Awakening. There were big gatherings with fiery preachers who spread a religious fervor throughout the land. The new lights favored those revivals, and the old lights opposed them, just so you're clear. Jonathan Edwards might be a name that you've heard of from our area. Wonderful sermon about sinners in the hands of an angry God, and that goes on. Okay. George Whitefield, who I have a picture here of him at one of his gatherings, and others preached differently than the typical preachers of the day, who were much more academic, and these were very emotional, fiery, passionate preachers. And they focused on the state of an individual's soul and sought to regenerate that sleepy church. The side effect of the Great Awakenings, this one and the ones that followed in the 19th and 20th century, include a boom in the establishment of churches of all kinds, including Baptists. So that's my clue to you that the Baptist church, despite persecution, eventually blossoms, right? In the early to mid-1800s, there was finally the disestablishment of Congregationalism as the state church, as the newborn United States began to live into its understanding and practice of religious freedom. We're going to talk a lot more about that in a minute. By 1790, so I just talked to you about the First Baptist Church in 1638. By 1790, there were 35 Baptist associations, approximately 560 ministers, 750 churches, and 60,000 members in the United States. So that's where we're at. That's how the story's going, okay? And then can change the slide for me. So as the colonies and the revolution happened and we were trying to form our country, it's really, I think, important for us to realize the critical, essential role that Baptists played in the early establishment of the United States. In the late 18th century, Isaac Backus, have you heard of that name? He was born in Norwich, Connecticut, lived in Middleborough, Massachusetts. Well, if you ever get hurt in Norwich, you'll go to Backus Hospital, named after Isaac Backus. So Isaac Backus, amongst others, challenged the notion that Baptists and other Christian groups, while tolerated, still had to pay taxes to support the established Congregational church. So at first they began fighting against this tax that was given to everybody except for those that were Congregational. Other Baptists confronted the issues in the South where Anglican influences were prominent. So even though Congregationalist churches weren't prominent in the South, Anglican churches were, and they had the same issues as Baptist churches. In most cases, change was slow to come, but progress in realizing separation of church and state had been made. John Leland, a pastor from Virginia, actively supported Thomas Jefferson's Religious Freedom Bill passed in Virginia in 1786. So Thomas Jefferson was greatly influenced by Baptists from Danbury, from Connecticut, from other areas, Philadelphia. in the formation of his understanding of what religious freedom was. And so he made that to pass in Virginia in 1786. But the idea was that they wanted to have that for everybody, not just state by state. So as a delegate nominee considering the proposed federal constitution, Leland originally proposed to vote against it because of its lack of provision for religious liberty. He offered his support, however, when his opponent for the state delegation position, James Madison, do you know that name? James Madison convinced him provision for religious liberty would be made in what became the Bill of Rights, the first 10 amendments to the Constitution. The Baptist influence thus was significant in the First Amendment that says, Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion or prohibiting the free exercise thereof. By 1833, all of the U.S. states had in their constitutions affirmed the principle of separation of church and state with full religious liberty. Okay. You good so far? This is fast. I'm taking you fast today. Okay. So, influenced in the formation of our country, and then Baptists became known for their fervor for wanting to share the good news of Christ everywhere. Everybody deserved it. Everybody was created by God. Everybody should hear about this. And so there is this great call for expansion and missionary work. And these pictures are some of the icons of Baptist history in regard to missionary work, which is very much at the center of who Baptists are. The first is the British pastor William Carey, who was the most influential figure in beginning the modern missionary movement, articulating the call to overseas service with the question, if the gospel was worthy of all acceptation, why is it not preached to all? He served as the first overseas representative beginning in 1793 and remained engaged in evangelistic and educational ministries for 40 years in and around Serampore, India. In fact, the first Baptist to evangelize in a foreign country was George Lely. I'm not sure how to say his name. He's the person on the lower left, a freed slave and first ordained black in America who sailed from Georgia to establish churches in Jamaica, friends from Jamaica over there, in the 1770s. Had you heard of George before? Have you heard of him before? Not really. Well, now you have. Now you have. And then, influenced by William Carey, there were some Congregationalists. They started out as Congregationalists, Adoniram and Ann Judson, and they set sail for India in 1812. But on their way to India, they were wrestling with the notion of baptism and concluding that only immersive baptism was scriptural. They both became Baptists. So they started out as Congregationalists when they left here. By the time they get to Burma and India where they were going, they were Baptists. No longer engaged by the Congregationalists and forced out of India by the East India Company, they settled in another mission field in Burma. We have a very, very huge mission field and connections with Burma. We actually are fighting for their safety and everything in what's now known as Myanmar, just so you know. This is where it all began. There, Judson was instrumental in church growth and discipleship until his death in 1850, and his vital legacy is acknowledged by Baptist leaders there today. So again, we have a very close relationship with the Burmese people. Another missionary originally sent to serve with the Judsons, Luther Rice, returned from India for medical reasons, and so he became known for raising support for missionary work, especially for the Judsons. His greatest contribution was motivating the creation in 1814 of the General Missionary Convention of the Baptist denomination in the United States for foreign missions. They believed in long titles back then. The first unified national missionary sending effort formed in the U.S. and the forerunner of today's American Baptist Board of International Ministries. Okay, so international ministries that we give to, this was their founding back in 1814. Rice preached and raised money for missionary work in many areas. He inspired Lot Carey, who later founded the African Missionary Society of Richmond and established the first Baptist church in Liberia. Rice also influenced John Mason Peck, a pivotal figure in domestic missionary work across the U.S. in the early and mid-19th century. In 1824, Rice and others helped form the Baptist General Tract Society, which later became the American Baptist Publication Society and eventually the American Baptist Board of Educational Ministries. So that's an organization that I served for many years early in my ministry. The goal of that original organization was to utilize educational means to disseminate evangelical truth and to articulate sound morals. Its work evolved through the printing of tracts into book and curriculum publishing. Educational outreach was undertaken throughout many parts in the U.S. in the 19th century, including through coal porters and chapel train cars. Have any of you been to Green Lake in Wisconsin, to our convention center there? Have you seen the chapel car? Been in the chapel car? It's probably been a while since you thought of it, but there's a chapel car there that they have refurbished so that you can see how they went about and did their ministry. Within the U.S., John Mason Peck, Isaac McCoy, and others exemplified the mission of the American Baptist Home Mission Society, founded in 1832, an evangelistic outreach ministry with Native Americans and the founding of educational institutions, of which Bacone College is one of them. Okay, next slide. So at some point in our history, this grand collection of Baptists, you need to realize, was really not, it was a loose society of organizations and congregations that worked together in this big, giant Baptist convention. However, in 1840, the American Baptist Anti-Slavery Convention held its first session in New York. Until then, Baptists had maintained a strained peace by carefully avoiding discussion of the topic of slavery. But in 1840, an American Baptist Anti-Slavery Convention brought the issue into the open. The Baptist Foreign Mission Board denied a request by the Alabama Convention that slave owners be eligible to become missionaries. Finally, a Baptist Free Mission Society was formed, and they refused to take Southern money. The Southern members then withdrew and formed the Southern Baptist Convention. The split was completed in 1845. So on there you'll have the copy on top of their first gathering of the Southern Baptist Convention in 1845. The Northern Baptists remained sort of a loose, continuing convention and society of working loosely together. But then in 1907, the Northern Baptist Convention was formed to structure coordination of the society's work while maintaining the autonomy of constituent churches. I'm going to talk to you a little bit in a second when I talk about Baptist distinctives about how Baptists work together, but just so you know that there was no sort of formal relationship until the formation of the Southern Baptist Convention in 1845. Southern Baptist Church is still with us today, and the Northern Baptist Convention in 1907. This is the part, I think, that Sally wanted to know, like, what happened there? Because we're not called Northern Baptist Convention anymore, right? Right. So just before I get onto that, the Ministers and Missionaries Benefit Board was founded in 1913, begun to meet medical, insurance, and pension needs of ordained and lay church workers, and so we still have MMBB today. Okay, so as the acknowledgement that American Baptist life and mission transcends any set geographical area, the Northern Baptist Convention was renamed the American Baptist Convention in 1950. Then in 1972, in the midst of reorganization that in part re-emphasized the congregation-centered mission of the denomination, its name was changed again to American Baptist Churches USA. So some of you were in Baptist churches at the time that was happening. Some of you were members of this church at the time that was happening in 1972. And there was this very intentional conversation that happened amongst American Baptists to say, to really be clear about the autonomy of the local church. So we are American Baptist Churches USA, We are not the American Baptist Church. There's a big difference between one organization that is uniform throughout and American Baptist churches that celebrate a great and grand diversity. Are you with me so far? So now you at least know where we came from. Okay, I'm going to stop there because I did almost 450 years of church history in an hour and 25 minutes. So do you have any questions from last time or this time about anything?
Well, some churches started in 1893. I was reading Wayland's mission statement, and it said that it was started in 1893.
Well, Connecticut, I'm going to have Charlie Wyand come next month and talk to you about American Baptists in Connecticut. My home church that I grew up in is the First Baptist Church in Connecticut that was founded in 1704. And so I'm going to leave that to him. You'll go back a little bit in history with Charlie, but he's just really a really delightful person and can tell you a lot. And I need to get another copy of our church's history because I gave mine away. And I would like to read it before he comes. I don't know who I gave it to, but hopefully they're enjoying it and learning a lot. Do you have a couple more than one? If anybody can give me one that I can keep, that would be great. That would be great. Okay, all right, so now, why are we the way that we are, right? Did you ever wonder, why do we do the things that we do? Why do we have the challenges that we have sometimes? Why do we practice the way that we practice? You know, these are all great questions. So now we're going to move on to our Baptist identity and some Baptist distinctives, okay? It's really hard for me to talk about Baptist distinctives because if you were to say, what do all Baptist churches share in common? They follow Jesus. That's about as far as I can go. So there's a joke that says, the rabbi will say, thus saith the Lord. The priest begins, as the church has always said, and the Baptist says, now, sisters and brothers, it seems to me. Baptists don't speak for anybody except for themselves, which I've been practicing as a pastor for a really long time. That is really, really hard to do. So I think I told you about the conversations that I had while I was on my trip to Ireland, where I had introduced myself at the beginning as a Baptist pastor. And a week later, after people had gotten to know me a little bit, sort of everybody was ready to start asking me about that and what that meant. And so starting at breakfast this one day through late evening, I'd had 5 conversations about who Baptists were and what we did and what that meant to me. And I just found myself constantly being like, look, this is me describing this. Like, if you were to go ask another Baptist, you'd probably get another answer. Like, it's really hard to explain, you know, when you're talking to somebody who's Roman Catholic or from another tradition that is much more uniform in it, you know. So I was like, all right, I'm going to venture here, but just so you know, I'm speaking for all Baptists, but you're only getting the opinion of one. It's kind of fun. All right, so a lot of my conversation, just for the sake of ease, is based on a book by Walter Sheridan called 4 Fragile Freedoms. And these are some things that you really need to understand about who we are to get why we are the way that we are, okay? And so the first of these, I'll have you switch the slide for me, Justin, is this concept of soul freedom, okay? Amen, amen there, Michael. Soul freedom is the historic Baptist affirmation of the inalienable right and responsibility of every person to deal with God without the imposition of creed, I love this next part, the interference of clergy, or the intervention of civil government. So where do you think that came from? As you heard about those early Baptists, those Anabaptists, really wanting to feel like this relationship that we have with God is personal between us. They just really reacted against the church, capital C, being the intermediary for everything. You needed a priest to get into heaven. You needed the church's blessing in order to receive God's grace in the sacraments and things like that. And so they just removed all of that in this concept of soul freedom. And what that means is that every person stands before God and is both competent and responsible for making their own decisions about their relationship with God. Baptists believe that this is a direct, personal relationship needing no outside mediation. Now, of course, we have clergy, we have each other, we talk, we learn from each other, and that sort of thing, but ultimately, it is not necessary to have anybody between you and God. There's just direct, this direct connection. Because, we believe, God created each person with a free soul. So Baptists then have resisted anything which seemed to them oppression of freedom of soul, and insisted on anything which seemed the expression of freedom of soul. We're going to talk about that a little bit later. People have the right to choose for themselves. Faith is voluntary, and that gets played out in a lot of our traditions and why we do things the way we do things. And Baptists are non-creedal then. Do you understand what I mean by that? So in a lot of other traditions, there will be a creed that gets said, the Apostles' Creed, or Lutherans, Anglicans, they have creeds. And Baptists, because of this idea of soul freedom, that's a covenant, that's different. That is a different thing. A creed means everybody believes exactly this, and we claim this together. And because of soul freedom, Baptists are very resistant to creeds, saying that everybody has to believe exactly this. Does that make sense to you? Now, that does not mean that there are not, and this is going to come later in the whole church freedom conversation, that there are not congregations who have created their own creeds. Now, some of us might argue that they're being very non-Baptist by doing so, but they're also being very Baptist by deciding for themselves as a congregation what they're going to do. So it's fun being Baptist, is it not? Right? Because anything goes. No, not quite. Okay. So I want to share with you this quote, next slide up. I don't know if you'll be able to read it. It's more for the people that, oh, did I not put that? Yeah. Okay, so that's soul freedom. And then the next slide, sorry, I forgot to have you change slides for me. Okay, C. Brownlow Hastings writes this about what this means. It is easy for us to yield our integrity and responsibility to some accepted authority, beloved pastor, honored teacher, influential book, even an edition of the Bible, respected parents, or dynamic church. These all have their proper role of influence, but the final choice of belief and practice must be made in the secret of the soul's naked presence before God alone. I may pray in corporate prayer or use a devotional prayer book, but unless their words are truly my words, I have not engaged God for myself. I have only said my prayers. I may study the Bible under great teachers and share with devoted Christian friends, but I must finally judge what is truth, not because I find it agreeable to me, but because the inner witness of the Spirit convinces me. I may profit by the testimony of another's experience of the Lord, but I do not need and cannot repeat their experience. I need my own. Okay, so that's at the heart of soul freedom. We all stand before God as individuals and are responsible for that relationship with God. With me so far? Which means that one of the things that we practice is baptism of believers. If you could change the slide. Right? For Baptists, baptism is a human response to God's action, God's activity in our life, and we want to respond by making this commitment. Because of soul freedom, Baptists believe that a person chooses to be baptized and makes a voluntary commitment to follow Jesus, right? So we do not baptize babies. It's not because we don't want them to be blessed and don't think they're wonderful. We dedicate and bless babies for sure, but we don't baptize them because we believe in soul freedom, and it is that baby's right to choose when they are old enough if they would like to be baptized and to follow Jesus. That's their choice. We are not, goes back to those words that Roger Williams says, that religion that is forced or compelled is not genuine. Right? Now, just to save myself with my colleagues that practice infant baptism, they do not see themselves as forcing their children into faith. There are lots of decisions that parents make for their children. Okay, so just, we are weird, we'll accept that, and we're going to accept our neighbors that practice differently, right? But that's why we do that. So I want to just stop here for a second and ask you, what do you remember about your baptism? Were you baptized when you're old enough, or were you baptized as a baby when your parents chose for you, right? That was how you were going to be raised, which is something parents do, right? So Dwayne, any memories back that far? Was the water cold? Was it, you don't know. My friend Dwayne was raised a Roman Catholic, and then he came here. You were as well.
I was as well, but then I went to New Testament Baptist Church, East Hartford,
Okay.
and I was learning like the Romans Road and how I can accept Christ,
Mm-hmm.
and things like that. And Pastor Scott, who is the pastor, was able to show me a lot about salvation and things like that. So I chose to be holy this baptism.
And so you were baptized as an older person. Okay. Okay. Anybody else? Were you Catholic as well when you grew up? Okay. And were not baptized again? Yeah.
I've done all three. Christian as a child, confirmed in
Yeah.
the church, and then after I got married,
Uh-huh.
I waited after I got married, so my pastor was still married. I got baptized in a little church in the state of New York.
Okay. As an adult. Okay. What do you remember?
I kind of remember my baptism, but the thing that I remember most of the time was my children.
Okay.
They were
Yeah.
baptized as babies because I
Okay.
married into a old Italian family,
Okay.
Catholic, so
Mhm.
you know that was fine with me.
Yeah.
And that would be, you know, valuable to them.
Mhm.
To have that.
Yeah.
And then they were also baptized in this church.
Were they as well? Okay. Okay. Mm. Yeah.
I just remember, I actually remember who was there in the group. Danny and Diane Lawrence, they were brothers and sisters. And David Kirkpatrick was the pastor, and I was 12 years old. And I remember the room where we had our classes, which was above the baptistry. It's like,
Oh, okay.
same looking at this building, but just say that room to the left where where all the candles are kept in.
Yep,
Had
the
stairs
flower
going
room.
up to the next floor.
Okay.
And so we had our classroom up there, and I just remember the whole experience because it was traumatic in the end. Because after I got baptized, my sister and I went to the local grocery store parking lot, which is in Almax in Westport, and rode our bikes together, and we were immediately like in the middle of an opportunity to be in the fight
Oh.
because the neighborhood kids came over and wanted to take our bikes.
Okay.
And we had to protect ourselves.
Uh-huh.
I'm thinking, this is the day I've been baptized. And all I could think was, like,
What would
later
Jesus
on in
do?
life I thought about this, that Jesus was tempted after his baptism. And I'm thinking, okay, this is probably,
That's your version. That's your version. Jesus was out in the desert with his bike and somebody wanted to take it away. You got it. That's a great story. Yeah, Lois. Were you baptized by your dad?
My father baptized me and my siblings, and I always, while he was the pastor of the church that we were in, and I remember thinking, I don't really have the choice not to.
Oh, Dad.
Not that, I mean, I've just remembered,
Yeah,
saying
yeah. Yeah. Is it Dad? Is it really? Yeah. Did you have the same experience or no? Maybe a little bit.
It wasn't that you decided you didn't want to, it was like,
This is what you do. I'm a Baptist and a preacher's child, and so therefore, this is what I do. Right, Joy? Joy, we have a few people in our church who are pastors' kids. Same thing, yeah. Yeah.
I remember being in baptismal when you baptized your children.
Yes.
I was there.
Were you helping me as a deacon?
Yeah,
Uh-huh.
that was great.
It's very powerful. Yeah. It's very hard not to cry while you're doing that.
when I was in sixth grade, I was baptized, and all my friends around the same time were confirmed.
Okay.
And I had a very Catholic teacher,
Mhm.
and she asked how many had been confirmed, and a number of kids raised their hand. She gave them all a dime because across the street was the farm shop. And I raised my hand. I said, I can baptize you, but that doesn't count.
Oh! Now, was this was a teacher in school?
Yes.
Separation of church and state, man. Yes.
I remember somebody, saying that I was baptized or something, and they're like, you weren't baptized before? You didn't belong to your parents.
You didn't belong to your parents. That's an interesting twist on it. Yes, faith.
And I was being on communion as a Catholic, they were saying, because I was baptized when I was young, in a operating room or whatever, because they felt that I wasn't going to make it. They said that it counts. So it was like,
Yeah.
The church that we belong to in Cato is like population 500 and state of New York, and it was a Cato Union Church. It was Presbyterian and Disciples of Christ, which is sort of like that. So we had a Baptist preacher and a Judson church. But I remember children were baptized, children were dedicated, and adolescents were baptized or
Confirmed.
Everybody,
Yep.
they belong to one unit of the church or the other.
Right.
But I can remember as a young mother, having been brought up in the, other tradition, it bothered me a little that my children were not Christian, especially with my first one. And, we dedicated them to sort of the same, it just bothered me just a little.
Yeah, sure. So interesting. I love hearing your stories. And talking with people who don't know a lot about Christianity, it's hard to explain these many differences that we still share, right, amongst each other. And so what happens too in churches like ours, for example, I'm not saying it's happening here, but just say, for example, ours, where we have people coming from all kinds of traditions, right? The question could arise in certain congregations, does it count? Does it count for membership? Does it count to come to the Lord's table, depending on what you believe about the Lord's table? So all of these wonderful questions, and then in the case that Juanita was talking about, what about a baby that is about to pass? These are the questions we got in seminary. Would you baptize a baby? I did. What was more important in that moment? The parent's grief or my judgment about how baptism should happen?
There's a love and compassion that takes place. Because it's against your technical belief.
Right.
Yet you've done it out of compassion and love.
But not about my belief about what God cares about. Yeah.
Compassion to take over in your
Yeah.
love.
So, interesting. All right, you ready to go on? This one you've heard, so we're going to move on to the next slide. This one you've heard a bit about, but let me explain it in some different ways. So religious freedom is the historic Baptist affirmation of freedom of religion, freedom for religion, freedom from religion, insisting that Caesar is not Christ and Christ is not Caesar. So historically, Thomas Helwys, you might remember that name from last time, one of the early Baptists in England, kindly reminded King James I, kindly reminded him, that the king is a mortal man and not God, and therefore has no power over the immortal souls of his subjects. King James disagreed, quite. And men's religion to God is betwixt God and themselves. And the king shouldn't get in the middle. The theological principle of religious liberty and the constitutional doctrine of the separation of church and state are two of our greatest legacies as Baptists. From early colonial days, Baptists have worked to establish and maintain religious freedom. When Baptists speak of religious liberty, they mean that decisions about faith and one's relationship with God are up to the individual, not the state. Baptists believe that the church can maintain its purpose and integrity best if it exists free from government interference, whether supportive or hostile. That supportive part I'm going to get to in a second, because we are not done fighting for religious liberty in the United States. So having experienced a history of persecution for being outside the norm, so to speak, Baptists are particularly sensitive to preserving the right of religious liberty for everyone, for all of that persecution that we underwent. The secular view of separation of church and state, for example, objects to state-mandated prayer out of a concern that prayer not be imposed on those who don't believe in it. The religious view of separation objects to state-mandated prayer because it believes firmly in the value and meaning and power of prayer and refuses to let the state determine what prayer is and when it should happen, alongside holding the view of soul freedom and the right of each individual to decide for themselves. You see the difference? Baptists are suspicious of any outside authority who would attempt to define what religion is and tell us how to practice it. But Walter Sheridan cautions and implores with others that Baptists not forget the Baptist witness for liberty for all. That message is much easier to hear, he says, and act upon when you are small and powerless, when you are fighting against something that is hurting you. When a denomination gets large and powerful and courted for political reasons, the bells of freedom ring fainter and flatter. So I just want to also have you note the distinction between religious freedom and religious tolerance. Okay? Freedom of religion represents a commitment to complete religious liberty and not simple toleration. Religious toleration is a concession. Religious liberty is a right. Religious toleration is a measure of expediency. Religious liberty is a matter of principle. So religious tolerance would say, it's okay for you to be who you are, however, we're still going to exert power over you. But we're going to tolerate that you're in our midst. Religious freedom means you have the right to be who you are. Okay? And one's right not to believe is as sacred as one's right to believe. So one of the guests that I hope to have come sometime next year are some visitors from the Baptist Joint Committee. Have you heard of the Baptist Joint Committee? Carol has. So the Baptist Joint Committee is a sort of a lobbying group. I'm going to use that phrase. I don't know if they would use it, but they're in Washington, D.C., and they're monitoring what's going on in the courts to make sure that religious liberty continues to be upheld and that the Constitution is read in a particular way. They describe themselves like this: we are attorneys, Capitol Hill insiders, ministers, mobilizers, and scholars. We file briefs in pivotal Supreme Court cases, advocate for and against legislation, testify in Congress, and unite with others across faiths to ensure that all Americans have and will always have the right to follow their spiritual beliefs. Founded in 1936, this is not a new thing, we bring our uniquely Baptist perspective of soul freedom to protecting religious liberty for all and defending the separation of church and state. BJC is the only faith-based group working on the national level with this singular focus. So without them, there's no one trying to help protect that part of the Constitution intentionally. So my question for you is their work important today? Do you think that we still need to fight for religious liberty in our country, or is it done? No, it's rhetorical for a second. I'll ask you more in a second. There are constant threats to the integrity of religious liberty and the interpretation of the Constitution. Chief Justice William Rehnquist wrote, "The wall of separation between church and state is a metaphor based on bad history, a metaphor that has proved useless as a guide to judging. It should be frankly and explicitly abandoned." And the pastor of a large, influential Southern Baptist congregation, Pastor W.A. Criswell, also stated, "I believe this notion of the separation of church and state was the figment of some infidel's imagination." This morning, before church, I read an article about Florida, who is trying to pass legislation so that chaplains may replace guidance counselors in the school system because they have a shortage of guidance counselors. Is that a problem for the separation of church and state, or no? Yes, Carol, you want to say something about this?
We even have a problem, and I think it was about a year ago, with a school board in this area, not West Hartford, was asked to perhaps give the students a day off on a certain non-Christian, non-Jewish holiday, and they reacted by saying, well, we don't even need to have holidays for all those religions. We'll give you fewer. I was like, okay, you just gotten into a church and state type of issue here. So it's really not that far away from us.
I have a different
It's
view.
right here.
Yeah,
And we don't even see it because it's so close.
go ahead, Michael.
Being a part of being a ministry in the military,
Mm-hmm.
we have chaplains
Mhm.
that serve all soldiers regardless of what
Yeah.
their beliefs are.
Right.
And the number one protection is the First Amendment
Mm-hmm.
for the chaplain,
Mm.
to make sure that everyone has the freedom to
Mm-hmm.
come, or to be a part of,
Mhm.
or to not choose a religion at all.
Mhm.
And that's the respect the chaplain provides to make sure that
Right.
the commander adheres to.
Right.
Because the commander could simply say, I'm Catholic, so you're going to go to Catholic church.
Yeah.
You know, and
Yeah.
then lay down his rule. The chaplain's got to step in and say, you know, do things that way.
Mm.
So in a school environment, it depends how the chaplain is, you know.
Is the chaplain trained to be respectful of the separation of church and state and religious freedom and soul freedom?
We have chaplains in hospitals.
We do. I served in a Catholic hospital, and they called me sister. It was great. Right. So what are the safeguards that might be put in place? Or are they just saying anybody, because it's very easy to be certified as a chaplain. There is not a national process for that. And so if someone decides nefariously, that's my word, to go and convert others, then there's not much standing in their way. That's the problem, right? So it's not gone. It's still there, and for us to be aware of that. And I hope that when the Baptist Joint Committee comes, that you'll sense support for the work that they do. You can't get away from it. Mm-hmm. 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 It's a very complicated issue. That you can have a place to pray in the office. Yeah. 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 the issues are complex, right? Let me just leave it there, that there's not an easy thing. However, I think that we need to be cautionary in the United States because Christians are still in the majority. And when you're in the majority, as Sheridan said, the bell of freedom is fainter and thinner, because if you're the one getting what you want, but at the expense of others not being able to exercise their right to practice the way that they feel called to by soul freedom, that's where we get ourselves in sticky situations, right? Okay, lots to talk about, so that'll be fun. I will forewarn the BJC when they come that you're going to be all over them for how they define religious liberty. And Kevin actually did a really great second hour on religious freedom and a bunch of different Supreme Court cases, and I may have to have him reprise that for you sometime before the BJC comes, because he did a great example of these cases, and you all had to judge. You all had to be that Supreme Court justice and decide which way would you lean. It's really great. Good job, honey. He doesn't remember it, but I have the PowerPoint in my computer. All right, how are we doing? All right, do you have time for one more freedom, or are you full? Always time for freedom. So I'm not done with the Baptist distinctives. We're not going to finish today, but this has just been a really great conversation. But I've got one more for you. I'm not going to do it. That way we did 2 today. We'll do 2 another time. I will not make you wait to know what they are, though. But in anticipation, we're going to talk about Bible freedom and church freedom. Church freedom and Bible freedom. And then worship for Baptists. What is that? And that sort of thing. So there's much more for me to talk about with you, but we've been here for just about an hour. And so I thank you for the conversation that we've had about religious liberty and about our baptisms and soul freedom and all of that. And I hope you're enjoying these series as well. Next month on the 3rd Sunday, again, Charlie Wyand, who has served on the American Baptist Historical Committee for many, many years, will come and talk to you about Baptists in Connecticut. So that'll be fun. All right? All right. Peace out. Thank you.